The cruelest choice is not the one that breaks your heart. It is the one that convinces the world you were never worthy of being chosen. Every torch surrounding Moonfall Court burned with silver-blue fire, painting the marble plaza in soft light that shimmered beneath the rising full moon. Thousands of wolves from every allied pack stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices hushed with anticipation as they waited for the moment history would remember forever. Tonight, Alpha King Adrian Ashford would name the woman destined to become his Luna. Evelyn Carter stood near the front of the ceremonial platform, her simple ivory gown moving gently in the cool night breeze. Unlike the noble daughters dressed in layers of embroidered silk and glittering jewels, she wore nothing that demanded attention. She had never needed to. Kindness had always been her greatest strength, even in a kingdom where kindness was often mistaken for weakness. For years, whispers had followed her wherever she walked. Some called her the future queen. Others believed the moon goddess herself had already chosen her long before this ceremony began. Even the palace servants smiled when they looked at Evelyn, certain that every quiet sacrifice she had made would finally be rewarded. Across the great staircase, Adrian appeared beneath the towering stone archway. His black ceremonial coat reflected the silver glow of the moon, and every conversation faded into silence the moment he stepped forward. He carried himself with calm authority, every movement steady, every expression impossible to read. His silver eyes swept across the gathered crowd before resting briefly on Evelyn. Time seemed to stop. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the music drifting through the courtyard. She remembered every conversation they had shared during difficult winters, every mission where they had fought beside one another, every promise that had never needed to be spoken aloud. Somewhere deep inside, hope quietly whispered that destiny had finally arrived. Adrian descended the final steps. The High Elder raised the ancient staff toward the moon, reciting words that had united Alpha Kings and their Luna for generations. Every gaze followed Adrian as he crossed the polished stone floor. He stopped only a few feet away. Evelyn lifted her eyes, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Then, without warning, Adrian continued walking past her. The silence became almost unbearable. He stopped before Vivian Blackwood, the daughter of one of the kingdom's oldest noble families. With measured grace, he reached for Vivian's hand and raised it before the entire court. "I choose Vivian Blackwood to stand beside me as Luna." No one moved. Even the wind seemed to disappear. Evelyn remained perfectly still, her expression calm despite the weight pressing against her chest. She heard scattered applause begin somewhere in the distance before it spread across the courtyard like falling rain. Smiles appeared. Congratulations echoed through the crowd. The celebration had already begun, yet it felt impossibly far away. Adrian looked toward Evelyn for only a single moment. Regret flickered behind his composed expression before duty buried it once again. Evelyn answered with the smallest smile, one so gentle that it almost hurt to see. She offered a graceful bow, turned without a single word, and walked through the opening crowd while every eye followed her fading silhouette. No accusations, no tears, no desperate plea to stay, only quiet footsteps disappearing beneath the moonlight. Before dawn, her small cottage overlooking the eastern cliffs stood empty. Her books were gone. Her belongings had vanished. Even the wildflowers she cared for had been carefully replanted into the surrounding fields, as though she wanted the earth itself to remember she had once been there. Search parties looked for her along every forest trail. Messengers rode hundreds of miles beyond the kingdom's borders. Weeks became months, and months quietly slipped into years. Eventually, people stopped asking where Evelyn Carter had gone. They convinced themselves she had simply become another forgotten Omega whose story ended the night someone else was chosen. None of them could have imagined that while the kingdom celebrated its new Luna, the woman they believed had disappeared forever was taking the very first step toward building an empire that would one day stand taller than every throne they had ever known. The eastern frontier was a place most maps ignored, where abandoned roads disappeared beneath tall grass and forgotten villages stood quietly beneath endless skies. Evelyn Carter welcomed the silence because it asked nothing from her. No one expected her to smile. No one whispered about the woman the Alpha King had left behind. Every sunrise became another chance to breathe without carrying the weight of the palace upon her shoulders. The first weeks were harder than she ever admitted, even to herself. She slept inside an empty mill beside a narrow river, wrapping herself in an old wool blanket while autumn rain tapped softly against the weathered roof. During the day, she traded the few silver coins she still possessed for bread, seeds, and simple tools instead of comforts. She planted vegetables in neglected fields that everyone else believed had lost their life years before. She repaired broken fences with her own hands. She cleaned abandoned wells until fresh water flowed again. The work exhausted her body, but each evening she felt something unexpected growing inside her. Peace. One chilly morning, an elderly farmer named Samuel Harper found her carrying buckets from the river before sunrise. He warned her that the land was cursed because every family who tried to settle there eventually left. Evelyn only smiled gently and asked him if anyone had tried planting orchards instead of wheat. Samuel laughed at the strange question, but 2 weeks later he returned carrying young apple trees in the back of an old wagon. Together they planted every sapling across the hillside. As winter approached, more strangers wandered into the forgotten valley. Some had lost their homes after harsh seasons. Others had simply grown tired of living beneath leaders who measured worth by bloodlines instead of character. Evelyn never asked where they came from. She only asked whether they had eaten that day. A widow named Grace knew how to weave warm blankets. 2 brothers repaired water wheels. A quiet blacksmith named Daniel forged sturdy farming tools from discarded iron. A young healer named Emily treated sick children with herbs gathered from nearby forests. Without realizing it, each newcomer added another stone to a future no one could yet see. Months slowly turned into a full year. The empty mill became a gathering hall where neighbors shared meals every Friday evening. The abandoned fields transformed into neat rows of vegetables stretching farther than the eye could follow. Laughter slowly replaced silence. Children chased one another across green meadows where nothing but weeds had grown before. Travelers passing through began speaking about a valley where no family went hungry and every honest worker was welcomed regardless of rank. Evelyn never called herself their leader. She worked beside everyone else, carrying lumber, harvesting crops, and comforting frightened children during storms. Yet whenever difficult decisions arose, every pair of eyes naturally searched for her. One spring afternoon, a merchant from nearly 300 miles away stopped to rest beside the marketplace that had quietly appeared where ruins once stood. He watched neighbors trading fairly without arguments, children playing without fear, and farmers freely sharing extra harvests with newcomers. Before leaving, he asked Samuel who owned this remarkable settlement. The old farmer smiled as he looked toward Evelyn, who was kneeling beside a little girl, patiently teaching her how to plant sunflower seeds. Samuel answered with quiet certainty, "No one owns this place." She simply reminded us that hope grows faster than fear when someone is brave enough to plant it first. Far beyond the valley, royal messengers continued searching for the missing Omega whose name had almost faded into memory, never imagining that while they searched for one broken heart, an entirely new future had already begun taking root beyond the edge of their kingdom. 3 years passed so quietly that even the mountains seemed surprised by the change. The lonely valley that had once been marked by abandoned homes and forgotten roads had become the busiest crossroads on the eastern frontier. Wagons filled with fresh produce rolled through its gates every morning. Blacksmith hammers echoed from sunrise until dusk. Children filled the streets with laughter instead of silence, and travelers no longer called the settlement the Forgotten Valley. They simply called it Haven. Evelyn Carter never intended to build a city. She only wanted to create one place where no one would ever feel worthless because of a title, a family name, or the cruel decision of someone more powerful. Yet every act of kindness seemed to attract another dreamer searching for a fresh beginning. Skilled builders arrived from distant territories after hearing stories of fair wages and honest leadership. Experienced merchants chose longer trade routes simply to do business in Haven because every agreement was honored with a handshake instead of hidden conditions. Farmers exchanged seeds instead of competing for every harvest. Inventors tested new irrigation systems across the surrounding fields, transforming dry land into acres of thriving farmland. The settlement grew faster than anyone could have imagined. Wooden homes became sturdy stone buildings. Dirt paths became broad streets lined with maple trees. A small trading square expanded into a bustling marketplace where voices from dozens of different packs blended together without fear or suspicion. What amazed newcomers most was not the prosperity, but the atmosphere. No guards demanded excessive taxes. No noble family claimed special privileges. Every child attended the same school regardless of birth. Every family helped rebuild a neighbor's home after storms. Hope had quietly become the strongest foundation in the valley. Samuel Harper often joked that Evelyn possessed no royal crown because the people themselves had become her crown. She always answered with a warm smile before returning to whatever work needed to be finished. Some mornings she inspected new bridges stretching across the river. Other afternoons, she walked through orchards planted years earlier, now heavy with bright red apples that filled the air with sweet fragrance. In the evenings, she still visited the gathering hall where neighbors shared stories over simple meals, just as they had during the settlement's earliest days. She refused to live inside a grand residence even after the town council insisted she deserved one. Instead, she remained in the modest stone cottage overlooking the river, believing a leader should never place unnecessary distance between herself and the people she served. Far beyond Haven, whispers began spreading through neighboring kingdoms. Merchants spoke of a mysterious settlement where prosperity seemed untouched by political struggles. Scholars traveled hundreds of miles simply to study its schools and workshops. Even wandering healers remained after witnessing hospitals where treatment was offered before payment was discussed. Nobody could agree on how such a remarkable place had appeared almost overnight. Some believed an ancient blessing protected the valley. Others insisted a brilliant noble secretly financed its success. Only those who actually lived there knew the truth. Their greatest treasure had never been hidden gold or magical power. It had always been the quiet woman who believed broken hearts could still build extraordinary futures. One crisp autumn afternoon, a royal tax collector arrived expecting another isolated frontier village that could easily be ignored. Instead, he found crowded streets, thriving businesses, overflowing warehouses, and trade records that rivaled the largest cities in the kingdom. As he stood speechless in the center of the marketplace, his eyes followed the respectful greetings every citizen offered to the same familiar woman walking among them without guards or ceremony. He quietly asked a shopkeeper who she was. The elderly merchant smiled with unmistakable pride before answering. "She is not our queen because she inherited a throne. She became our leader because she taught us that dignity can build what fear never could." The collector rode away before sunset, carrying reports that would soon reach the royal court. And for the first time in many years, the kingdom that had forgotten Evelyn Carter was about to hear her name again. Power could preserve a throne, but only wisdom could preserve a kingdom. 5 years after the moon-choosing ceremony, the royal capital still stood as magnificent as ever, its towering walls gleaming beneath the morning sun, but behind the polished marble and elegant banners, quiet cracks had begun spreading through the foundation of Alpha King Adrian Ashford's reign. He remained respected across the allied packs, and his victories had secured years of stability, yet something invisible had changed. More merchants requested permission to reroute their caravans toward the eastern frontier instead of the capital. Skilled craftsmen quietly relocated their families to new opportunities beyond the kingdom's borders. Young healers accepted invitations from distant settlements where they believed their talents would be valued more fairly. At first, the royal council dismissed the reports as temporary trends. Lord Marcus Hale insisted the eastern settlements would collapse under their own ambition within a single harsh winter. Vivian Blackwood agreed without hesitation, reminding the council that no frontier community could ever rival the influence of the Alpha King's court. Adrian listened in silence. The numbers placed before him suggested otherwise. Tax revenues from several neighboring territories had begun falling for the third consecutive year. Trade caravans arrived less frequently. Visiting ambassadors spent more time asking about the mysterious eastern settlement than discussing royal alliances. Even more unsettling, ordinary citizens spoke of that distant community with admiration instead of curiosity. They described clean streets, honest courts, thriving schools, and markets where fairness mattered more than family names. One afternoon, Adrian stood alone beside the palace balcony overlooking the capital below. From that height, he could see crowded avenues filled with merchants and travelers, Yet something felt different. The city remained wealthy, but its energy had changed. Conversations no longer carried the excitement they once had. Hope had quietly been replaced by routine. His thoughts drifted somewhere he had spent years refusing to revisit. Evelyn. He remembered the calm smile she had offered before leaving the ceremony, without anger or accusation. Sometimes he wondered whether that silent farewell had been more painful than any harsh words could have been. He had convinced himself that choosing Vivian had been necessary for political stability, that duty demanded sacrifice. But as the seasons passed, duty became a lonely companion. Vivian excelled at court appearances and formal ceremonies, yet she rarely walked among ordinary citizens or listened to their concerns. Every discussion returned to prestige, influence, or noble expectations. Adrian often found himself searching crowded halls for conversations that no longer existed, thoughtful questions only one person had ever asked him, quiet observations that had once brought clarity during difficult decisions. Meanwhile, another detailed report arrived from the eastern frontier. This one included carefully drawn maps, trade figures, and population estimates. The settlement, once dismissed as insignificant, had expanded into a prosperous city connecting multiple territories through commerce rather than conquest. Independent villages had voluntarily joined its growing alliance. Local disputes were settled peacefully. Harvests reached record levels despite unpredictable weather. At the bottom of the report, one sentence captured Adrian's attention more than every statistic above it. Leadership remains anonymous. Citizens simply refer to their founder as the woman who never stopped believing in people. Adrian read those words several times before slowly folding the parchment. A memory stirred deep within him, a familiar voice telling frightened strangers that every person deserved another chance. He could not explain why his heartbeat suddenly quickened, but for the first time in many years, he felt an irresistible pull toward the eastern frontier, unaware that every road leading there was quietly guiding him back toward the woman he had once believed he had lost forever. Some reunions arrive with celebration, while others arrive wrapped in silence so deep that one heartbeat can change the course of history. The invitation reached the royal palace at the beginning of spring, sealed with dark blue wax embossed with an unfamiliar crest. It was not a request for tribute or military support. It was an invitation to negotiate a commercial alliance between the Kingdom of Ashford and the rapidly expanding Free Alliance of Haven. The royal council gathered around the great oak table, studying the documents with growing concern. Every page revealed another astonishing achievement. New trade routes stretched across hundreds of miles. Harvest production had doubled within 4 years. Independent settlements had voluntarily joined the alliance without conflict or coercion. Even neighboring kingdoms had begun sending official representatives. Lord Marcus Hale frowned as he lowered the final report. This leader grows too influential, he warned. We should remind them who rules these lands. Vivian Blackwood nodded in agreement, but Adrian remained focused on a single sentence written near the bottom of the report. Leadership welcomes cooperation, never domination. The words felt strangely familiar. Calm, confident, unshaken. They sounded less like a challenge and more like an invitation from someone who had already discovered strength without needing anyone's approval. 3 weeks later, the royal procession crossed the eastern mountains beneath clear blue skies. Adrian expected another prosperous frontier city. Instead, he found something entirely different. Broad stone roads stretched for miles, lined with flourishing maple trees whose fresh leaves danced in the warm breeze. Massive warehouses stood beside peaceful neighborhoods filled with gardens and playgrounds. Schools overlooked public squares where merchants from countless territories traded openly with smiles instead of suspicion. Every corner reflected thoughtful planning rather than careless expansion. There were no frightened faces rushing to impress royalty. People continued their daily lives with quiet confidence, greeting visitors with courtesy instead of fear. Adrian noticed something he had not witnessed in years: genuine contentment. As the royal delegation approached the central government hall, a crowd gathered naturally along the boulevard. Children waved happily. Shopkeepers offered fresh bread and fruit to tired travelers. Musicians continued performing cheerful melodies without interruption. Nobody behaved as though a king's arrival required them to become someone else. Samuel Harper, now older but standing proudly beside the entrance, welcomed the delegation with a respectful bow before leading them through towering wooden doors carved with scenes of harvests, rivers, classrooms, and families working together. There were no statues celebrating rulers, only murals honoring ordinary people building extraordinary lives side by side. The council chamber itself overlooked the river where countless ships quietly loaded goods bound for distant ports. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating a circular table rather than a throne. Adrian studied the room with quiet curiosity until the far doors slowly opened. Every conversation stopped. Footsteps echoed gently across polished stone. A woman dressed in a simple, deep blue gown entered with calm, effortless confidence. She wore no crown, no jeweled necklace, no symbol of rank beyond the respect reflected in every face around her. Her chestnut hair rested neatly over her shoulders, and her gentle gray eyes carried the same quiet warmth he had never forgotten. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Adrian rose from his chair without realizing he had moved. The years disappeared in a single breath. Evelyn Carter stood before him, no longer the heartbroken Omega who had quietly walked away beneath the moonlight, but the founder of a thriving alliance built through compassion, wisdom, and unwavering determination. She offered the same graceful smile he remembered from years ago, though now it carried the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to know her worth. "Welcome to Haven, Your Majesty," she said with calm sincerity. "I hope your journey was pleasant." Adrian searched for words that refused to come. Around them, the council members exchanged curious glances, unaware they were witnessing two lives unexpectedly colliding after years spent traveling in opposite directions. In that single unforgettable moment, Adrian understood that while he had spent years protecting a kingdom, Evelyn had quietly built something even greater, and for the first time since the night she disappeared, he realized the greatest loss of his life had never been a political decision. It had been the woman now standing only a few feet away, stronger than he had ever imagined possible. Truth rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it waits patiently behind years of silence until someone finally has the courage to ask the right question. The negotiations continued for 3 days, and every discussion left Adrian Ashford more unsettled than the last. Haven was everything he had once believed impossible. Farmers sat beside merchants when policies were discussed. Teachers advised engineers. Healers helped shape public health decisions alongside village elders. Every proposal was debated respectfully before reaching a conclusion. There was no fear in the council chamber, only trust earned through years of shared purpose. Adrian watched Evelyn carefully during every meeting. She listened far more than she spoke. When disagreements surfaced, she never silenced opposing voices. Instead, she asked quiet questions that guided people toward common ground. It reminded him of countless conversations from years ago, when she had always found solutions others overlooked because she chose to understand before she judged. That evening, unable to quiet his thoughts, Adrian wandered alone through Haven's riverside gardens. Lanterns reflected across calm water while families gathered beneath flowering trees, laughing together as musicians filled the cool spring air with gentle melodies. No palace guards hurried citizens away. No noble reserved the best seats. Everyone simply belonged. He stopped near a memorial stone overlooking the river. Unlike monuments honoring kings or famous victories, this one carried hundreds of engraved names. Ordinary people, builders, farmers, teachers, midwives, blacksmiths. Beside the memorial stood Samuel Harper, who recognized the Alpha King immediately. The old farmer greeted him warmly before noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. "You built something extraordinary," Adrian admitted quietly. Samuel smiled. "No, Your Majesty. She did. We simply believed her when no one else would." Adrian hesitated before asking the question that had followed him since arriving. Why did she leave without telling anyone where she was going? Samuel looked toward the flowing river before answering. Because she understood that healing sometimes begins where memories cannot follow. His words settled heavily inside Adrian. The following morning, another unexpected discovery awaited him. While touring Haven's public archives, he noticed detailed records preserving every important decision made since the city's founding. Among them rested an old leather journal donated by the settlement's earliest residents. Curious, Adrian opened the carefully preserved pages. He expected plans for buildings or harvest schedules. Instead, he found handwritten promises made during Haven's first winter. We will never measure a person's worth by status. We will always choose fairness over pride. No child will inherit another person's shame. Every sentence carried the same graceful handwriting. Evelyn's. As he slowly turned another page, a folded letter slipped onto the wooden table. It had never been sealed or addressed. Time had faded the ink, but every word remained clear. I once believed being chosen would give my life meaning. I was wrong. Meaning is not something another person grants you. It is something you build each day through the lives you lift beside your own. Adrian closed his eyes. For years he had believed Evelyn disappeared because heartbreak had defeated her. Now he realized she had walked away not to escape her pain, but to become someone greater than her sorrow. Later that afternoon, as negotiations resumed, a royal messenger arrived unexpectedly from the capital carrying urgent correspondence. Lord Marcus Hale reported growing political unrest among several noble families and increasing pressure from neighboring territories seeking trade agreements with Haven instead of the royal court. Vivian Blackwood urged immediate action to limit Haven's influence before it grew stronger. Adrian folded the letter slowly without responding. For the first time, he questioned not only the decisions being made in his kingdom, but the voices he had trusted for years. Across the council table, Evelyn calmly reviewed economic reports with her advisors, completely unaware that the foundation of Adrian's certainty had begun to crumble, and hidden beneath years of unquestioned loyalty, the first pieces of a much larger truth were finally beginning to reveal themselves. Storms do not always begin with dark clouds. Sometimes they begin with a single decision made by people who fear losing what they cannot control. News of the successful negotiations spread quickly across neighboring territories, and with every passing week, more independent villages expressed interest in joining Haven's growing alliance. The prosperity that had once seemed impossible was now impossible to ignore. Caravans stretched for miles outside the city gates. New workshops opened every month. Farmers reported their strongest harvest in decades, while schools welcomed children from families who had traveled hundreds of miles searching for a better future. Yet not everyone celebrated Haven's success. Back in the royal capital, Lord Marcus Hale gathered influential nobles behind closed doors, warning that Haven threatened the traditional order of every allied pack. Vivian Blackwood supported his concerns, insisting that if the Eastern Alliance continued expanding, the authority of the crown would slowly weaken without a single battle ever being fought. Their solution was simple: convince neighboring territories to reject trade with Haven by spreading doubt about its leadership and intentions. Rumors quietly appeared across distant markets. Some claimed Haven planned to replace the kingdom. Others insisted its prosperity could not possibly last. But every merchant who had actually visited the city returned with the same answer. They had seen fairness instead of deception, honesty instead of fear, and opportunity instead of empty promises. Lies struggled to survive where truth had already taken root. Adrian watched these developments with growing concern. During another council session inside Haven, he finally spoke privately with Evelyn for the first time since their unexpected reunion. They walked along the river at sunset, while golden light reflected across the calm water. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comfortable. Adrian finally broke it. There are people who want to stop everything you have built. Evelyn looked toward the distant orchards where children laughed beneath blooming apple trees. There have always been people who feared change, she answered softly. Fear becomes dangerous only when good people allow it to make their choices for them. Adrian studied her calm expression. If pressure continues to grow, my kingdom may be forced into decisions neither of us wants. Evelyn turned toward him with the same gentle composure that had once comforted frightened strangers years earlier. Then let us protect people before we protect pride. Those words stayed with Adrian long after their conversation ended. The following morning, delegates from several frontier communities arrived unexpectedly at Haven's council hall. Instead of asking for military protection or political favors, they requested membership in the alliance because they wanted their children to grow up in a place where effort mattered more than birth. Evelyn welcomed each family personally, speaking to every elder, every craftsman, and every child with equal respect. Adrian watched from across the chamber as the newest citizens were greeted with warm applause instead of suspicion. For the first time, he understood why Haven continued growing despite every obstacle. Its greatest strength had never been wealth or influence. It was trust. Later that evening, another royal messenger reached Adrian with alarming news. Several noble houses had begun organizing economic restrictions against Haven without his direct approval, acting under recommendations issued by Lord Marcus Hale. Adrian lowered the letter slowly, realizing events were moving faster than he had expected. Across the courtyard, he saw Evelyn helping volunteers unload supplies for newly arrived families, smiling as though every burden became lighter when shared together. In that quiet moment, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Whatever conflict lay ahead, he would no longer stand silently between old loyalties and obvious truth, because he finally understood that protecting a kingdom meant protecting the people who gave it life, and no one embodied that truth more completely than the woman who had once walked away with nothing except her dignity. The greatest lies are not the ones spoken aloud. They are the ones repeated for so many years that everyone mistakes them for truth. Adrian returned to the royal capital with a quiet determination that no member of his court had ever seen before. Instead of accepting the reports placed before him without question, he began reviewing records that had remained untouched since the moon choosing ceremony years earlier. Palace attendants searched forgotten archives while royal historians uncovered correspondence buried beneath stacks of sealed documents. One discovery led to another until a pattern slowly emerged. Letters recommending Vivian Blackwood as the only politically acceptable choice had all passed through Lord Marcus Hale's office. Reports praising Evelyn had mysteriously disappeared before ever reaching the Alpha King's private chamber. Invitations requesting Evelyn's presence at important council discussions had been quietly redirected or canceled without explanation. Even messages written by ordinary citizens expressing admiration for her wisdom had never reached Adrian's desk. None of those actions alone seemed overwhelming, but together they revealed years of carefully shaped influence. Adrian sat alone inside the royal library long after sunset, surrounded by faded parchment and forgotten records. Every page deepened the weight already pressing against his heart. He remembered believing he had made the difficult choice required of a king. Now he realized that choice had never been presented honestly. The truth had been carefully hidden behind polished advice, political pressure, and carefully selected information. Across the kingdom, a special royal assembly was announced. Nobles, elders, merchants, and representatives from every allied territory gathered inside the Great Hall, uncertain why such an extraordinary meeting had been called. Vivian entered confidently, expecting another formal ceremony. Lord Marcus carried himself with the same practiced certainty that had guided the court for years. Then Adrian stepped forward. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the enormous chamber. Instead of delivering another political address, he ordered the recovered records to be presented before every witness. One document after another was read aloud. Forgotten letters, altered recommendations, hidden reports. The hall grew quieter with every revelation. Faces that had once admired Lord Marcus slowly filled with disbelief. Vivian's confident smile disappeared as she realized the carefully constructed narrative surrounding the past was unraveling before everyone. When the final document had been read, Adrian spoke again. "A kingdom cannot stand on incomplete truth," he said. "Neither can a king." His words echoed through the chamber. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone with anger. He simply accepted responsibility for the years that had followed. "I allowed myself to believe what was convenient instead of searching for what was true. That failure belongs to me." Those present lowered their heads, not because they had been commanded to, but because genuine humility carried more weight than authority ever could. Several days later, Adrian returned to Haven, not with soldiers, advisors, or ceremonial banners, but with only a small delegation. The council chamber overlooked the same peaceful river where children laughed beneath the afternoon sun. Evelyn welcomed him with the same quiet courtesy she extended to every visitor. Before anyone expected what would happen next, Adrian stepped forward and slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The room fell completely silent. Council members stared in astonishment. Samuel Harper quietly removed his hat. Even the breeze drifting through the open windows seemed to pause. Adrian lifted his eyes to Evelyn with complete sincerity. "Years ago, I believed I had chosen the future of my kingdom," he said softly. "Today, I understand that I failed to recognize the person who was already building a better one. I cannot change the past, but I can finally honor the truth." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment without triumph or resentment. Her expression carried only quiet compassion, leaving everyone in the chamber wondering how she would answer the man who had once unknowingly walked away from the greatest gift destiny had placed before him. For a long moment, no one inside the council chamber spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that appears when every heart understands it is witnessing a moment that will be remembered for generations. Evelyn looked at Adrian as he remained on one knee, not as the alpha king who once stood beyond everyone's reach, but as a man who had finally laid down his pride. She remembered the frightened young woman who had walked away beneath the full moon years earlier, believing her story had ended. She also remembered every sunrise that followed, every seed planted in forgotten soil, every stranger who became family, every child whose laughter had transformed an abandoned valley into a place called haven. None of those blessings had come from revenge. They had come from choosing hope instead of bitterness. A gentle smile touched her face as she stepped forward. "Please stand," she said softly. Adrian rose slowly, searching her expression for anger that never appeared. "I forgave you long before we met again," Evelyn continued. "Not because what happened did not hurt, but because carrying resentment would have imprisoned only me. The past shaped us, but it does not have to rule what comes next." Her words settled across the chamber like warm sunlight after a long winter. Samuel Harper smiled quietly while many council members lowered their eyes, moved by a grace they had rarely witnessed in leaders. Adrian nodded, emotion visible in his silver eyes. "Then allow me to earn, not expect, your trust," he replied. "Not as someone seeking forgiveness alone, but as someone willing to build beside you instead of ahead of you." Evelyn extended her hand. After a brief pause, Adrian accepted it. There was no grand proclamation, no ceremony declaring destiny fulfilled, only two people choosing mutual respect with complete honesty. That simple gesture earned louder applause than any royal celebration either of them had ever attended. Over the following months, the Kingdom of Ashford and the Free Alliance of Haven signed a historic partnership based on shared prosperity rather than dominance. Trade routes expanded across the region. Schools exchanged teachers and apprentices. Healers traveled freely between communities. Farmers shared new methods that increased harvests across every neighboring territory. Families who had once feared uncertain futures discovered opportunities they had never imagined possible. Adrian visited Haven often, not to issue commands, but to learn. He walked through orchards with Samuel, listened to young inventors explain new ideas, and spent long evenings speaking with Evelyn about the future they hoped the next generation would inherit. Every visit reminded him that true leadership was measured not by how many people stood beneath a ruler, but by how many people rose because of one. Years later, visitors arriving at the river overlooking Haven often noticed two stone benches facing the sunset. There were no statues celebrating victory, no monuments honoring a single ruler. Instead, a small bronze plaque carried a simple inscription: "The strongest kingdoms are built by hearts that choose compassion over pride." Children often asked who had written those words. The elders would smile and point toward the bustling city surrounding them. "Look around," they would answer. The answer is everywhere. And as evenings settled across the valley, Evelyn and Adrian stood together overlooking the thriving streets below, not because fate demanded it, but because both of them had become worthy of standing beside one another. Their story was never about the woman who was left behind. It became the story of the woman who discovered her own worth, built hope where none existed, and proved that the greatest empire anyone can create is one where every person is given the chance to belong.